November 1943. 25,000 feet above Nazi-occupied Europe, Lieutenant Jimmy Morrison gripped the controls of his P-38 Lightning as ice crystals began forming on his cockpit canopy. The twin-engine fighter, America's fastest warplane, was supposed to be invincible at this altitude. Instead, it was becoming a flying tomb. Morrison's breath came in white puffs inside the cramped cockpit. The heater had failed again, the third time this month. At 40 degrees below zero, while frostbite would claim his fingers within minutes. But that wasn't the worst part. The real terror came when engine oil began thickening like molasses, threatening to seize the engines completely. A P-38 with dead engines at 25,000 feet was just an expensive coffin. Across the 8th Air Force, P-38 pilots were reporting the same deadly pattern. Missions launched with full squadrons returned with half their aircraft, not from German fighters or flak, but from engines that simply quit working in the brutal cold of high-altitude combat. The Army Air Forces called it mechanical failure. Pilots had a different name for it, frozen death. The P-38 Lightning was supposed to be America's answer to German Luftwaffe dominance in European skies. With its distinctive twin-boom design and twin engines, it could outrun, outclimb, and outfight anything the Germans flew. In the Pacific theater, P-38s were racking up victories against Japanese Zeros, but over Europe, where combat occurred at altitudes the Pacific never demanded, America's premier fighter was failing catastrophically. The problem wasn't the airframe or the pilots. It was something far more basic and far more deadly. The engines simply couldn't function in extreme cold. Oil systems failed, fuel lines froze, and heating systems designed for lower altitudes proved useless in the stratosphere. For every P-38 lost to enemy action, 2 more were lost to the unforgiving physics of high-altitude flight. What made this crisis particularly devastating was timing. Operation Point blank, the strategic bombing campaign against Germany depended on long-range escort fighters. Without P-38s providing protection, American bombers were being slaughtered by German interceptors. The entire air war hung in the balance, and America's most advanced fighter was proving unreliable when needed most. Wright Field, Dayton, Ohio, hummed with desperate energy. Colonel Benjamin Kelsey stared at the stack of incident reports covering his desk like accusations. Each page documented another P-38 failure over Europe. Engine seizures, oil system failures, pilots forced to bail out over enemy territory because their engines quit without warning. 17 P-38s lost this week alone, reported Major Frank Phillips, sliding another folder across Kelsey's desk. And that's not counting the ones that limped back with engine damage. At this rate, we'll have grounded the entire Lightning fleet by spring. Kelsey had championed the P-38 program from its inception. The twin-engine design was his brainchild, born from a requirement for a high-altitude interceptor capable of reaching 20,000 feet in 6 minutes. On paper, the Lightning was perfect. In the frozen skies over Germany, it was becoming a disaster. The engineering team had tried everything conventional wisdom suggested. They'd modified oil formulations, adjusted fuel mixtures, and redesigned heating systems. Nothing worked. The fundamental problem remained at altitudes above 20,000 feet, where temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Fahrenheit. The P-38's Allison V1710 engines simply couldn't maintain operating temperature. The Allison boys say it's impossible, Phillips continued. Liquid-cooled engines can't generate enough waste heat at high altitude to keep themselves warm. The math doesn't work. They're recommending we switch to air-cooled radials like the P-47. But switching engines meant redesigning the entire aircraft. It would take 2 years minimum, assuming the project received approval. Meanwhile, American bomber crews were dying because they lacked adequate fighter escort. The 8th Air Force needed a solution now, not in 1946. Previous attempts had ranged from logical to desperate. Engineers had tried larger radiators, hoping to retain more engine heat. The modification reduced cooling efficiency and actually made overheating worse at lower altitudes. They'd experimented with alcohol injection systems to prevent fuel line freezing. The alcohol corroded fuel system components and created new failure mode. Most recently, they'd attempted to solve the heating problem by routing exhaust gases through cockpit heaters. The modification worked briefly, then carbon monoxide began leaking into pilot compartments. 3 test pilots had been hospitalized with CO poisoning before that approach was abandoned. "Face it, Colonel," Phillips said grimly, "we've thrown our best engineers at this problem for 6 months. Either we accept that the P-38 can't operate effectively over Europe, or we find a completely different approach, something nobody's thought of yet." Helen Morrison wasn't supposed to be in the high-security engineering meeting at Allison Engine Company, but nobody had specifically told her to leave. As the only female thermodynamics engineer at Allison, she'd learned that survival meant making herself invisible when necessary and indispensable when possible. The meeting was going badly. Chief Engineer Harold Stevens was explaining to Colonel Kelsey why the P-38 engine problem couldn't be solved. "The physics are non-negotiable," Stevens declared. "At high altitude, ambient temperatures drop below -40. Our engines generate insufficient waste heat to maintain operating temperature. There's simply not enough thermal energy in the system." Morrison listened from the back corner, her notebook filled with calculations the senior engineers weren't considering. She'd been studying this problem for weeks, running numbers that didn't appear in any official reports. The solution seemed obvious to her, but it contradicted everything conventional engine design taught. "What if we're approaching this backwards?" she said quietly. The room fell silent. 12 male engineers turned to stare at the young woman who'd just interrupted their technical discussion. Stevens's face darkened with irritation. "Miss Morrison, this is a classified engineering meeting. Perhaps you should return to your desk." "All with respect, sir. I've been analyzing the thermal dynamics data. Everyone's trying to make the engine generate more heat. What if instead we prevented heat loss more effectively?" Colonel Kelsey leaned forward slightly. "What do you mean?" Morrison opened her notebook, her hands trembling slightly, but her voice gaining confidence. "Current cooling systems are designed to dump heat as quickly as possible to prevent overheating. But at high altitude, we have the opposite problem. What if we could create a variable cooling system that retains heat when needed?" Stevens interrupted harshly. "Miss Morrison, engine cooling systems don't work that way. You can't simply turn cooling on and off. The engine would overheat during climb-out and low-altitude operations. Unless you created a bypass system that could redirect coolant flow based on altitude and temperature conditions, a thermostat-controlled system that maintains optimal engine temperature regardless of ambient conditions." The room was dead quiet. What she was describing had never been attempted in aircraft engines. It would require completely rethinking cooling system architecture, adding complexity to systems that needed to be reliable in combat conditions. "And that's theoretically interesting," admitted Dr. Robert Collins, the senior thermodynamics engineer. "But the complexity would be enormous. Multiple thermostats, bypass valves, redundant systems. The weight penalty alone would be prohibitive." Stevens stood up, clearly wanting to end this discussion. "Well, Miss Morrison, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but aircraft engine design isn't theoretical physics. We deal with practical constraints, weight, reliability, manufacturing complexity. Your idea might work in a laboratory, but it's completely impractical for combat aircraft." Morrison felt her face flush with frustration and embarrassment, but Colonel Kelsey was still looking at her thoughtfully. Colonel Kelsey made a decision that would change everything. 3 days after the disastrous meeting, he appeared unannounced at Helen Morrison's desk in the secondary engineering bay, where junior staff worked on routine calculations. "Miss Morrison, I need to ask you something directly. How many P-38 pilots do you think are going to die this winter?" If we don't solve this engine problem? Morrison looked up from her slide rule, startled by the blunt question. I don't know, sir. Dozens. Maybe more. Try hundreds. The 8th Air Force is planning major operations this spring. Without reliable high-altitude escort fighters, we're going to lose bombers and crews at rates that will shock the American public. Your thermostatic cooling idea might sound crazy to Stevens, but crazy is what we need right now. He slid a manila folder across her desk. Congratulations. You just became project leader for experimental cooling system development. You'll have a team of 3 engineers, access to the test lab, and exactly 6 weeks to build a working prototype. Morrison stared at the folder like it might explode. Sir, I'm just a junior engineer. Shouldn't Dr. Collins or someone with more experience lead this? Collins thinks your idea is impossible. Stevens thinks it's impractical. I think it might save lives. Sometimes fresh eyes see solutions that experience misses. Kelsey stood to leave, then paused. One more thing. This project is classified under direct orders from the War Department. You report only to me. Stevens and the senior staff don't need to know details until you have something that works. Morrison spent that evening in her tiny apartment, sketching system diagrams by lamplight. The concept was elegantly simple in principle. Instead of dumping engine heat into the surrounding air through radiators, capture and redirect that heat when ambient temperatures dropped below optimal levels. She envisioned a network of thermostatic valves that would monitor coolant temperature at multiple points throughout the engine. When temperatures dropped too low, the valves would reduce coolant flow to the main radiators and increase flow through a secondary heat retention system. Essentially, the engine would recycle its own waste heat instead of dumping it overboard. The next morning, she met her assigned team, Bob Turner, a cooling system specialist who'd been passed over for promotion twice, Mary Chen, a young MIT graduate whose valve design expertise nobody was utilizing, and Frank Kowalski, a machinist whose unconventional manufacturing ideas made senior engineers nervous. And they gave us the misfits, Turner observed wryly as they gathered in the cramped test lab Kelsey had allocated. With the woman engineer, the foreign graduate, the promote-from-the-ranks machinist, and the 2 young specialists, not exactly the A-team. Or maybe that's exactly what we need, Morrison replied. Well, the A-team has been failing at this problem for months. Time to try a different approach. Chen had been studying Morrison's sketches. The thermodynamics are sound, but the control system complexity is enormous. We'd need at least 6 different valve positions to maintain optimal temperature across all flight regimes. Well, what if we simplified it? Kowalski suggested. Instead of trying to control everything, what if we just focused on the specific problem? High-altitude heat retention. Create a system that only activates above 15,000 feet. Morrison felt excitement building. A 2-stage system, normal operation for climb-out and low-altitude flight, then automatic switching to heat retention mode at high altitude, much simpler control logic. They spent the next week designing a prototype system that could be retrofitted to existing P-38 engines. The modification required adding a secondary coolant loop, installing altitude-sensitive thermostatic controls, and routing additional heating lines to the cockpit. On paper, it looked promising. Now comes the hard part, Turner said, studying their final design drawings, building it and making it work. The first prototype system lasted exactly 17 minutes before catastrophic failure. Morrison watched in horror as coolant sprayed across the test cell, coating the walls with green liquid that hissed and steamed against the hot engine components. The thermostatic valve had jammed in the closed position, blocking coolant flow completely. Engine temperature had spiked to dangerous levels before automatic shutdown systems killed the test. Well, that was spectacular, muttered Bob Turner, surveying the mess. At least we know the shutdown systems work. Frank Kowalski was already examining the failed valve, his mechanic's instincts probing for the root cause. The actuator spring couldn't handle the pressure differential. When coolant pressure built up, it forced the valve closed instead of open. Basic engineering failure. Morrison felt sick. 6 weeks had become 5 weeks, and their first attempt had been a complete disaster. Worse, word of the failure was already spreading through the engineering department. She could imagine Stephen's satisfied reaction. The junior engineer had proven herself incompetent, just as he'd predicted. "Will we redesign the valve system?" Morrison said firmly. "Kowalski's right about the pressure differential. We need fail-safe operation, not fail-dangerous." Mary Chen had been quietly studying the failure data. But the concept still works. Look at the temperature readings before the valve failure. For those 17 minutes, the engine was maintaining optimal temperature despite simulated high-altitude conditions. The thermodynamics are correct. We just need better hardware. The second test came a week later with completely redesigned valve mechanisms. This time, the system operated for 3 hours before failing differently. The secondary coolant loop developed air bubbles that disrupted circulation, causing uneven heating and temperature spikes in specific engine cylinders. Air purging problem, Turner diagnosed. The coolant routing creates dead spots where air can accumulate. We need better circulation design. The third test featured revised coolant routing and improved air purging systems. It ran for 6 hours before the cockpit heating system began producing carbon monoxide. Apparently, the modified heat exchanger was allowing exhaust gases to contaminate the heating air. 3 different failure modes, Morrison noted grimly. "We're solving problems, but creating new ones each time. At this rate, we'll run out of time before we run out of ways to fail." Kowalski had a different perspective. "Actually, we're making progress. Each failure teaches us something the textbooks don't cover. The original concept is sound. We're just working through implementation details." But implementation details were proving murderous. The fourth test revealed that the thermostatic controls responded too slowly to rapid altitude changes, causing temperature swings that would stress engine components beyond acceptable limits. The fifth test showed that the additional weight of the cooling system affected aircraft balance enough to change handling characteristics. By the end of the 4th week, Morrison's team had logged dozens of test hours and identified 16 different failure modes. They'd solved most of them, but each solution seemed to create new complications. The system was becoming so complex that reliability was actually decreasing instead of improving. "Maybe Stevens was right," Turner said after their latest failure. "Maybe this is just too complicated for combat aircraft. Too many things that can go wrong." Morrison stared at the latest batch of test data, feeling the weight of approaching deadlines and mounting skepticism. Colonel Kelsey had been patient, but patience had limits. The spring bombing offensive was approaching, and pilots were still dying from engine failures over Europe. "Well, we're missing something fundamental," she said finally. "The physics work, the concept is sound, but we're over-engineering the solution. What if we went back to basic, found the simplest possible approach that solves the core problem?" Chen looked up from her calculations. "You mean abandon everything we've built? I mean find the essential element that makes this work and strip away everything else." The bureaucratic knives were being sharpened. Chief Engineer Harold Stevens stormed into Colonel Kelsey's office carrying a thick folder of failure reports. "Colonel, this Morrison project has become a dangerous waste of resources. 5 weeks of testing, multiple catastrophic failures, and no working system. Meanwhile, we're neglecting proven approaches that could actually help our pilots." Kelsey didn't look up from the intelligence reports covering his desk. "But what proven approaches? You've had 6 months to solve this problem with conventional methods. The results speak for themselves. We could modify fuel systems to prevent icing. We could improve cockpit insulation. We could develop better pilot survival equipment, practical solutions that don't require redesigning entire cooling systems." Stevens slammed the folder down. What this woman is chasing theoretical impossibilities, while pilots die waiting for real solutions. The criticism was spreading beyond Allison. Morrison had begun hearing whispers in the hallways. Other engineers openly questioned why scarce resources were being diverted to Morrison's fantasy project, when more experienced teams had practical alternatives under development. Dr. Robert Collins approached Morrison directly after a department meeting. "Helen, I respect your enthusiasm, Tom, but you're damaging your career. Stevens is documenting every failure, every resource expenditure. When this project inevitably gets cancelled, you'll be blamed for wasting war material and delaying practical solutions." "Well, the practical solutions aren't working," Morrison replied. "How many more pilots have to die while we pursue incremental improvements to failed approaches?" "That's not your decision to make," Collins said coldly. "You're a junior engineer, not a military strategist. Your job is to support the team, not pursue personal projects that make the entire department look incompetent." The pressure intensified when word reached Wright Field headquarters. General Frank Carroll, commanding officer of the Air Technical Service Command, sent a blistering memo questioning resource allocation at Allison. Why was a critical war program being delayed by experimental projects led by inexperienced personnel? Kelsey found himself defending Morrison's work to increasingly skeptical superiors. "Sir, conventional approaches have failed completely. We need innovative solutions, even if they seem unconventional." "Innovative is one thing, Colonel," replied General Carroll. "Wasteful is another. I'm getting reports of repeated failures, cost overruns, and missed deadlines. How does this serve our pilots in combat?" The bureaucratic assault reached Morrison through official channels. Stevens issued a formal directive reassigning her to routine calculation work, effectively ending her access to test facilities and prototype development resources. The directive cited project management concerns and resource utilization efficiency. Morrison appealed directly to Kelsey, finding him in his office late one evening. Surrounded by casualty reports from the European theater, "Colonel, they're shutting down the project. Stevens claims it's a resource allocation issue, but he's been working to undermine this from the beginning." Kelsey looked exhausted. "Helen, I'm fighting battles on multiple fronts. The Pentagon wants results. Allison management wants conventional solutions. Combat commanders want anything that keeps their pilots alive. Your approach might work, but might isn't enough anymore. Give me 2 more weeks. We've identified the core problem. The solution is simpler than we thought. Just 2 more weeks to prove the concept. 2 weeks to do what 5 weeks couldn't accomplish." Morrison pulled out her latest design sketches. "We've been over-engineering this. The breakthrough came yesterday. Instead of trying to control coolant temperature, the entire system, we focus on one critical point, the oil cooler. Keep oil temperature stable, and everything else follows." Kelsey studied the drawings. The new approach was elegantly simple compared to their previous complex systems. "This would work. But the math says yes. The physics says yes. I just need enough time to build and test a prototype." Outside Kelsey's office, institutional resistance was hardening into outright opposition. Stevens had allies throughout the engineering hierarchy who viewed Morrison's project as dangerous precedent. If junior engineers could bypass established procedures and pursue independent research, the entire organizational structure would collapse. 2 weeks, Kelsey decided. "But this is absolutely your last chance. If this doesn't work, the project ends and you return to routine assignments." Helen Morrison stood alone in the dimly lit test cell at 3 a.m, watching temperature gauges that refused to cooperate. Her simplified design had been running for 6 hours, longer than any previous attempt, but the oil temperature was still fluctuating beyond acceptable limits. 2 weeks had become 10 days, and she was running out of both time and ideas. Frank Kowalski found her there at dawn, slumped over her notebook filled with desperate calculations. "Helen, when's the last time you slept?" he asked, setting down 2 cups of coffee. "Sleep is for people whose careers aren't ending in 4 days," she replied without looking up. The oil cooler thermodynamics are right, but something's causing temperature oscillations. The system works in theory, but theory doesn't keep pilots alive. Kowalski studied the temperature charts. As a machinist who'd worked on hundreds of engines, he saw patterns that engineering theory sometimes missed. You know what this looks like? Hunting behavior? Like a thermostat that's cycling too fast, overshooting the target temperature. Morrison looked up sharply. What's the response time? We calculated optimal valve timing based on steady-state conditions, but real flight involves constant altitude changes. The system is trying to respond to every minor temperature variation instead of maintaining stable averages. What if you slowed it down, made it less sensitive to short-term fluctuations? Morrison grabbed her slide rule, running quick calculations. But a damping mechanism, instead of responding to instantaneous temperature readings, respond to temperature trends over longer time periods, smooth out the oscillations. By noon, they'd modified the thermostatic control system with simple mechanical dampers that prevented rapid cycling. The theory was sound, but they needed a test to prove it worked. Problem is, we can't simulate rapid altitude changes in the test cell, Turner pointed out. Well, we need actual flight conditions to validate this approach. Morrison made a decision that would either save her career or end it spectacularly. And then we flight test it. Install the system in an actual P-38 and see if it works at altitude. That's completely against protocol, Mary Chen warned. Untested modifications in operational aircraft. Stevens will have you court-martialed. Stevens is going to kill the project anyway. This is our only chance to prove the concept under real conditions. That afternoon, Morrison approached Colonel Kelsey with her proposal. His response was immediate and emphatic. Absolutely not. I cannot authorize flight testing of unproven modification. If that aircraft goes down, I'll be explaining to Congress why we risked pilot lives on experimental equipment. Colonel, we're risking pilot lives every day with engines that failing system could save dozens of lives, but only if we can prove it works under actual. Was quiet, studying weather reports from the European theater. Spring operations were beginning, and P-38 squadrons were reporting continued engine failures at alarming rates. There might be another way. What if we could arrange an unofficial test? A pilot who volunteers to evaluate the system during routine training flights. You mean find someone willing to risk their career on my engineering? I mean find someone who understands that calculated risks might prevent certain deaths. The pilot they found was Captain James "Lucky" Patterson, a test pilot who'd already survived 3 P-38 engine failures and had strong opinions about altitude performance. When Morrison explained her modification, his response was characteristically direct. "Lydia, I've been flying P-38s for 2 years. I've watched good pilots die because their engines quit at 25,000 feet. If your gadget can fix that, I'll fly it. If it kills me, at least I'll die trying to solve the problem instead of ignoring it." 3 days later, Patterson climbed into a P-38 equipped with Morrison's prototype cooling system. The flight plan called for routine high-altitude testing, but everyone involved knew this was far from routine. At 25,000 feet, Patterson radioed ground control. "Engine temperatures holding steady, oil pressure normal. This is the first time I've flown at this altitude without engine problems. Whatever that lady engineer did, it's working." The celebration was premature. Captain Patterson's successful test flight had lasted exactly 18 hours before disaster struck. During his second high-altitude mission, the prototype cooling system suffered a catastrophic failure at 22,000 feet over Lake Michigan. Patterson barely managed to dead-stick the aircraft to an emergency landing at a training field, but the P-38 was destroyed and the pilot hospitalized with severe hypothermia. Harold Stevens burst into Morrison's lab like an avenging angel. "Miss Morrison, you are hereby relieved of all project responsibilities and placed under investigation for unauthorized modification of military aircraft. Your reckless experimentation nearly killed a test pilot and destroyed a $250,000 fighter aircraft." Morrison stared at the wreckage report, feeling her world collapse. The cooling system had worked perfectly for the first hour of flight, then suffered a cascade failure when a secondary valve froze solid, blocking coolant flow completely. The very problem she'd been trying to solve had destroyed her solution. "Sir, the failure mode is identifiable and correctable. We just need to modify the valve design to prevent ice formation." "Enough!" Stevens slammed his hand on the lab bench. "Well, this project is terminated immediately. You will report to administrative services for reassignment to routine calculation duties. Any further contact with experimental projects will result in dismissal from Allison Engine Company." But even as Morrison's project died, the P-38 crisis was escalating beyond anyone's ability to ignore. The worst month of engine failures in the aircraft's history had just concluded. 17 P-38s lost to mechanical problems, with only 4 pilots recovered alive. The European theatre commanders were threatening to ground the entire Lightning fleet unless immediate solutions were found. Colonel Kelsey found himself in an impossible position. General Carroll was demanding explanations for the failed Morrison project, while simultaneously insisting that engine problems be solved immediately. "Colonel, I don't care about engineering theories or experimental failures. I care about operational aircraft that can escort our bombers without falling out of the sky. Sir, conventional approaches have reached their limits. We need innovative solutions, even if they involve some risk." "Risk? You call destroying aircraft and nearly killing pilots cold risk? That's not innovation. That's incompetence." Meanwhile, combat reports from Europe were becoming increasingly desperate. Major General James Doolittle, commanding the 8th Air Force, sent a classified cable that cut through all bureaucratic nonsense. "P-38 engine failures are compromising our entire strategic bombing campaign. We need immediate solutions or we're switching to different aircraft types. American bomber crews are dying because they lack reliable escort fighters." The pressure reached Morrison through unofficial channels. Bob Turner found her cleaning out her desk, preparing for transfer to the calculation department. "Helen, you need to see this," he said quietly, handing her a decoded message from a P-38 squadron in England. "They're losing pilots every week. Engine failures over enemy territory. The guys who survive are being captured or worse." Morrison read the casualty reports with growing anguish. Names, ages, hometowns, 22-year-old pilots dying not from enemy action, but from engineering failures she might have prevented. Turner: "What if we were right about the concept, but wrong about the implementation? Patterson's system worked until that valve froze. What if there's a simpler solution that eliminates the failure mode entirely? Stevens will have you arrested if you even think about touching that project again." Morrison looked at the casualty list again. "How many more pilots are going to die while we follow proper procedures? The war won't wait for bureaucratic approval." That night, Morrison broke into her own laboratory. Working by flashlight to avoid detection, she examined the wreckage of Patterson's cooling system. The failure point was obvious: a single thermostatic valve that had accumulated ice crystals until it jammed completely. But studying the damage patterns, she realized something that had escaped everyone's attention. The valve hadn't failed because of her design. It had failed because of standard P-38 installation procedures that created a moisture trap. The solution wasn't more complex engineering. It was simpler engineering that eliminated moisture accumulation entirely. By dawn, she had sketched a completely revised approach that would work with existing P-38 systems without requiring any new components. The breakthrough wasn't technical, it was conceptual. Morrison knew she had one chance left, and it wasn't through official channels. Captain Patterson had been released from the hospital that morning, bruised but determined. When Morrison approached him at the base hospital, his response surprised her. "Ma'am, I've been thinking about that flight every day. Your system worked perfectly until that valve froze, but I noticed something during the failure sequence that might interest you." Morrison leaned forward. "What did you notice?" "The engine oil temperature stayed stable even after the coolant system failed." Whatever you did to the oil circulation kept working independently. That's what gave me enough time to reach the emergency field." Morrison's pulse quickened. "You mean the oil temperature regulation worked even when the main cooling system failed?" "Exactly. The cockpit got cold and the coolant overheated, but the oil stayed at operating temperature. Which tells me your basic idea is sound. You just need to focus on the oil system and forget about the rest." That revelation led Morrison to her final breakthrough. Instead of trying to control the entire cooling system, she would modify only the oil circulation system. Oil was less likely to freeze than coolant, required simpler routing, and directly affected engine operation. A small modification that solved the core problem without creating new complications. Working in her kitchen that night, her laboratory access had been revoked. Morrison designed a simple oil circulation bypass that would automatically route warm oil through critical engine components when temperatures dropped below optimal levels. No thermostatic valves, no complex controls, just a mechanical system that responded to oil viscosity changes. The elegance was breathtaking. As oil cooled and thickened at high altitude, flow resistance would automatically redirect circulation through secondary channels that retained more heat. When oil warmed up, normal flow patterns would resume, self-regulating, foolproof, and requiring only basic modifications to existing oil pumps. But she had no way to test the concept. Her project was terminated, her access revoked, and any unauthorized work would result in immediate dismissal. Patterson solved that problem with typical pilot directness. "Ma'am, I'm scheduled for routine high-altitude tests next week. If someone happened to modify my aircraft's oil system the night before, and if that modification happened to work, well, I guess that would be an interesting coincidence." "Captain, I can't ask you to risk your career on my engineering." "Lady, you're not asking, I'm volunteering. This war is bigger than careers or regulations. If your idea can save pilots, then we test it." The aircraft was modified during an unofficial night shift. Morrison and Kowalski worked by flashlight, installing the oil circulation bypass using standard maintenance procedures. The modification was so simple, it looked like routine maintenance. Only 4 people knew what was really being tested. At 28,000 feet, higher than any previous successful P-38 operation over Europe, Patterson radioed ground control with steady confidence. Oil pressure holding. Temperature stable. Engine performance normal. This bird is running like she was designed to work at this altitude. For 2 hours, Patterson pushed the aircraft through high-altitude maneuvers that would have caused engine failures in standard P-38s. The oil system modification performed flawlessly. Engine temperatures remained stable, power output stayed consistent, and cockpit heating, now properly supplied with stable engine heat, kept the pilot comfortable. Ground control. This is the best high-altitude performance I've ever seen from a P-38. Whatever was done to this aircraft needs to be done to every Lightning in the fleet. Harold Stevens stood in the test facility, staring at data that contradicted everything he believed about engine design. "Run those numbers again," he ordered the technician monitoring Patterson's flight test results. "There has to be an error." "No error, sir." Oil temperature held steady at 180 degrees throughout the entire 2-hour high-altitude test. Engine performance remained within normal parameters at altitudes where standard P-38s experienced consistent failures. Stevens grabbed the data sheets himself, scrutinizing every measurement. For months, he'd been telling anyone who would listen that Morrison's approach was fundamentally flawed. Now her modified aircraft was performing better than any P-38 in the fleet. Colonel Kelsey arrived an hour later, summoned by urgent reports of successful testing. Stevens met him at the door, his usual confidence replaced by grudging confusion. "Colonel, I owe you an apology, and Miss Morrison deserves recognition. Her oil circulation modification has solved the high-altitude engine problem." "You're saying it actually works?" "Not only works, it's elegant, simple, reliable. Everything we should have been looking for from the beginning." Stevens paused, clearly struggling with his words. "I was wrong to dismiss her approach. This modification could save dozens of pilot lives. Word spread rapidly through Wright Field and back to combat units in Europe. Within days, P-38 squadrons were requesting immediate installation of Morrison's oil system modification. The engineering solution was so simple that field mechanics could implement it using standard tools and readily available parts. Dr. Robert Collins, who had criticized Morrison's project as impractical, became one of its strongest advocates after reviewing the test data. Helen's approach represents exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need in wartime engineering. Simple solutions to complex problems, focused on immediate operational requirements rather than theoretical perfection. The transformation was remarkable. Engineers who had questioned Morrison's competence were now studying her modification techniques. The same oil circulation principles were being applied to other engine problems throughout the Air Force inventory. But the real validation came from combat pilots in Europe. Major William Leverett, commanding a P-38 squadron in England, sent a cable that would be quoted in engineering textbooks for decades. Morrison modification installed fleet-wide, high-altitude engine failures eliminated P-38s now operating effectively at 30,000 feet without mechanical problems. Request immediate recognition for the engineer responsible. This modification has saved my squadron. Captain Patterson, fully recovered from his emergency landing, became Morrison's most vocal supporter. That lady engineer solved a problem that was killing pilots every week. Her modification turned the P-38 from a high-altitude liability into our most reliable escort fighter. Every pilot in Europe owes her their life. Even General Carroll, who had criticized the project's resource allocation, acknowledged Morrison's achievement. Miss Morrison's oil system modification represents the kind of practical innovation that wins wars. Simple, effective, and immediately implementable. This is how military engineering should work. The most satisfying moment came when Stevens personally approached Morrison with a formal apology. Miss Morrison, I let conventional thinking blind me to innovative solutions. Your approach saved pilot lives and enhanced our combat capability. I was wrong to oppose your work, and I hope you'll accept my recommendation for immediate promotion to senior engineer status. Morrison's response was characteristically focused on results rather than recognition. Sir, the important thing is that P-38 pilots can now operate at high altitude without engine failures. Recognition is secondary to operational success. Within 6 weeks, Morrison's modification had been installed on over 400 P-38 aircraft across the European and Pacific theaters. The numbers told the story that would define Helen Morrison's legacy. Before her modification, P-38 squadrons in Europe averaged 23% mission abort rates due to engine failures at high altitude. Pilot survival rates from mechanical failures were less than 30%. The Lightning was being withdrawn from European operations. After her modification, high-altitude engine failure rates dropped to less than 2%. P-38s became the preferred long-range escort fighter for deep penetration bombing missions over Germany. Pilot survival rates increased dramatically because engines remained reliable in combat conditions. By war's end, Morrison's oil circulation modification had been installed on over 2,400 P-38 aircraft across all theaters. Conservative estimates credited her innovation with saving at least 127 pilot lives and enabling successful completion of dozens of critical bombing missions that might otherwise have failed due to inadequate fighter escort. The broader impact extended far beyond World War II. Morrison's approach, focusing on simple, reliable solutions to complex engineering problems, became standard methodology in post-war aircraft development. Her principle that elegance beats complexity in combat systems influenced jet engine design throughout the Cold War era. Major General James Doolittle, in his post-war memoirs, wrote, Miss Morrison's modification exemplified the American engineering mindset that won the war. Practical solutions, rapidly implemented, focused on immediate operational requirements rather than theoretical perfection. Her work saved pilots and enhanced our strategic bombing capability at a critical moment in the European campaign. Morrison herself remained characteristically modest about her achievement. In a 1947 interview, she said, "I simply applied basic thermodynamic principles to a practical problem." The real heroes were pilots like Captain Patterson, who risked their lives testing unproven modifications. My contribution was just engineering. Their contribution was courage. But her legacy transcended engineering. Morrison became a symbol of how individual innovation could change the course of major conflicts. Her story inspired a generation of women to enter engineering fields previously dominated by men. The Society of Women Engineers established the Helen Morrison Award in 1952, recognizing outstanding contributions to practical engineering solutions. The P-38 Lightning, saved from potential obsolescence by Morrison's modification, went on to become one of the war's most successful fighter aircraft. Famous pilots like Richard Bong and Thomas Maguire flew P-38s to record-breaking victory totals. The aircraft that nearly failed due to high-altitude engine problems became synonymous with American air superiority. Today, Morrison's principles remain relevant in aerospace engineering. Modern aircraft engines incorporate sophisticated thermal management systems that trace their conceptual origins to her simple oil circulation bypass. NASA engineers working on high-altitude atmospheric research aircraft still reference Morrison's reports when developing engine systems for extreme operating conditions. Perhaps most remarkably, Morrison's story demonstrates how critical problems can be solved by questioning fundamental assumptions. While senior engineers focused on making engines generate more heat, she asked why engines couldn't retain heat more effectively. That shift in perspective, from generating solutions to preserving solutions, opened possibilities that conventional thinking had missed. Helen Morrison died in 1987 at age 73, having spent her post-war career developing jet engine cooling systems. Her obituary in Aviation Week noted that her P-38 modification remained in use on restored aircraft, still solving the same high-altitude engine problems that had stumped an entire generation of senior engineers. The woman whose crazy art engine idea saved dozens of P-38 pilots had proven that innovation often comes from unexpected sources, that simple solutions can solve complex problems, and that individual determination can change the trajectory of history itself.